Hey, welcome. Let's see if I've got this set up correctly. I just tried to start earlier and had no sound. So I'm gonna come back. Oh, yep, I can hear myself. Perfect. All right, so welcome to the first day of the crown cutting. This is day 7 overall of cutting this piece of citrine that I've been working on. I finished the pavilion already, and as you can see, it looks a little bit different now on the bore cam. Some of the changes that I ended up doing was transferring the stone from the top that you see up here to the bottom. So what I've used is what's called a cone dop. I have one right here that I can illustrate. Basically, the cut part that we've been working on, the pavilion, I've taken the stone, removed the brass part that was holding it, and put the side that we've cut so far into what's called a cone dop. This cone dop is shaped exactly as it sounds, like a cone. And basically, all I'm doing is putting some epoxy within this cone section and pushing the stone's finished pavilion side into that. So I can basically transfer from the cut side of the pavilion to the uncut side of the crown. So in order to finish this gem, I will need to be able to cut the entire crown to the specifications outlined by the cut sheet that I have here. In this case, we're going to be cutting something that looks similar to this when it's completed, where it's kind of a square pillow cut, like so. It's called the double cross square. It's created by the late Jeff Graham, one of the better faceting designers for novice cutters. This specific cut is actually one of his paid designs, so I can't show the whole cut list because otherwise then that might be interfering with some of his estate's um, property rights or intellectual property rights. But I did want to show you at least the idea of what it's going to get to so you can understand what it'll look like when it's complete. So far we've completed the pavilion. The pavilion is now inside of this cone dop with epoxy here. And we're now going to be working on the crown on top. So as you can see, if you look at the bore cam, there is now our epoxied in pavilion stone. And the rough top was just the preform cut that was done to this stone beforehand. Um, some of the things that you did not get a chance to see is me actually using a transfer jig. In my case, I use a polymetric transfer jig that looks like this, and basically putting the stone in between, applying super glue. I do plan to do a future, or not super glue, but epoxy, and getting the stone transferred. In the future, I do plan on having that whole process videoed, but for the sake of my sanity and having to move around cameras all over the place in order to capture that video, I did not necessarily want to do that. Also, you don't have very much time when you're doing this to get the mix proper, putting it in, making sure everything's lined up. Usually only about 5-ish minutes before the epoxy starts to set. So I didn't want to get into a situation where I think that something's looking good on camera, but it's not, and I'm spending too much time on the camera only to find out that I've now transferred the stone wrong. So just to skip that step, I've already done all that ahead of time for this video. Um, the other things I've done is I've already switched out the cutting lap, so now I'm back to my 600 grit cutting lap. I probably, in the future, when I have a more worn out D-light lap, will use a D-light lap instead. However, mine are all still pretty new, and I don't want to use them necessarily to cut, since they're technically a polishing lap. Um, but for now, I'm just going to begin the cut. The first series on this crown of cuts is going to be the C1 cut. And it's done, there's 4 different index cuts within that, so that way you can get basically the edges to start being cut down. Um, I've already cut and polished the pavilion, so being able to now cut to the pavilion to its true size or just a hair above it is what I'm going for, is my goal. I have set my girdle size that I would like to have on this finished stone to be about 0.05 millimeters, which is quite narrow. If you look there, you can barely see the width of that as being 0.5. It's actually 0.51 right there, but I could not get my caliper to get any more accurate. So, in comparison, if you look on the bore cam, 0.51 is roughly that wide. So I'm going to be cutting off everything above the top jaw right here to that width for the girdle, which means that a majority of this girdle that I've spent so much time trying to polish is now just going to be cut away. That is the general gist of polishing and cutting, is you always want to polish, because just in case, you might never know if you need to cut more or cut less, and it's always better to have something that looks nice on its final revision than not looking nice. So without further ado, I'm going to begin this cut. Again, we're just starting off at with 4 different cuts for this first set of cuts, and there's a total of 6 cuts plus the table cut, which is the final top part that is flat that you would look through on a stone. So let's get going. Okay. Alright. Set this off to the side. Just listening to some music as well, since this whole section, excuse me, is taking a little bit of, or it can get a little tedious in certain instances. Alright, so beginning off, we're cutting this side that my finger's pointing to. I might adjust this camera angle to better show that side. If you give me 1 second, I can adjust this correctly. Ah, unfortunately, it can be difficult to position this camera correctly. But we're going to be cutting this side right here that my fingernail is touching, this flat edge, so that it's easier to see. Also going to change my color and lighting since I have a bulb that can change the color to a more blue, so it's easier for y'all to see exactly what I'm seeing. I can still cut in blue light, and it allows the facets to be a little bit more visible with ambient light bouncing around the room. So let's begin. So I am cutting to a center point on this on all 4 sides. Okay, being very careful. This is a thicker, or it's a 600 grit cutting lap, but it still cuts quite fast, especially with the citrine material. I'm also going to apply some more light so I can see what I'm doing. I might actually just adjust this camera a little bit so y'all can see what I'm kind of looking at. I kind of move it back and forth to be able to see my, oh sorry, my nose itches, to see how much I've cut and where I've cut it. And in this case, if you look on the main monitor, you can see that I'm very quickly just moving back and forth and back and forth. So in the bore camera, you can now see that I've already cut off this much of the material just from the little bit that I've cut. You're seeing right here the epoxy as it kind of creeps up the stone, but the edge of the girdle is right here, the bottom edge, and the new upper edge of the girdle is now what I'm cutting. So I want to get that to, again, that about 0.05 millimeter depth in order for it to be a proper girdle width. Too thick of a girdle does not always bode too well, just because it doesn't look right. Also, it can be difficult for a setter to set if it has too thick or too thin of a girdle. Um, so, so generally accepted is about that point, around 0.02 to 0.05. That uh, is what most amateurs would do. In this case, my stone is right at about that border of using a percentage method, which is where you would take the width and find a certain percentage to create the girdle, a certain percentage of the width of the stone. So in this case, I'm just going with the generic 0.2 to 0.5, depending on how I like it. And I can always start off thicker and then work my way from a thicker girdle to a thinner girdle, from a 0.5 to a 0.2, which is why I'm starting with 0.5 first and seeing how it will look. It seems to be coming along nicely. I am going to be using my glasses, my magnifying glasses though, because I want to see how straight the cut is. And I will also be not quite making it to the full final 5 or 0.05 millimeters on the first pass of facets, just because I want to make sure that all the edges line up first, because if they don't line up, then I need to course correct and make sure that everything is going to look good. Okay, I'm going to go on to the second cut just to start seeing if things are going to line up around the girdle width. So you can see how quickly that's already began to take off material. The second cut is this cut right here, from here. This was cut ahead of time by the um, the person who was going through the rough and determining what was good rough and bad rough. So I'm trying to cut away what is here, so that way I have just a straight cut and a straight and even leveled top girdle around the entirety of the stone. Oops. Since this is a cutting lap, it's going to cut a lot quicker than the polishing lap that I was doing just on the last part of the pavilion videos. And that was that white type of lap. I'm going to go back and see how far I cut. Okay. So on my dial indicator, I'm trying to cut to the same depth of cut on all of these facets so I can see whether or not they're going to line up across the stone, and then make any left or right course adjustments before cutting down to the final 0.5 depth. I'm working on the third side now. Okay, so now at this point all three sides that I've cut so far should be equal. Wipe off some of the water there. So this is the side I just cut. I've yet to cut this side, but I've already cut the other side opposite of this as well. Going to switch it over to the last facet. This is a 24. Okay, so now all four sides so far have been cut to the same depth, as you can see on this side right here, which I just finished. This is the fourth of the facets, and this side right here, which is the third facet that I just cut. So now that all four of those are there, I can check to make sure that the corner sections, so between here and here, are going to be level with each other, because when you transfer stone you can have slight misadjustments that will happen that will cause the stone to either go a little bit more to the left or more to the right, and you don't want that, because if you have that, then the girdle will have what's called a step cut, where it'll look like one side is just a little bit higher than the other side of the girdle. And so you can correct that by either adjusting what's called the cheater. In my case, it's this dial right here. Let me see if I can get a better visual. If you look on the main camera view, I'm pointing to it with this tool. This right here is the cheater, and this allows my machine to, which has, let's see if I can adjust it down. There we go. Which has this little brass bit right here that will move left or right to be able to slightly cheat, as it's called, and move the index over by a little bit, a hair's breadth to the left or to the right. Okay, set that back up to right around here, and then go from there. So the next thing I'm going to do, all of the C2 facets, which are the corners, so here and here and whatnot, all of those are a little bit deeper of a cut on the angle of attack than the current cut. The current is 56 degrees, and those are 51 degrees. So I'm going to have to kind of just keep cutting with these first before I go and adjust my entire machine to do the second set of cuts. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to start again. Oh, and I wanted to actually start at 0 again. It's always better to start at 0 because it's easy to remember. Did I start at 0? Did I start at, or what number did I start at? Now I do use epoxy, super glue, wax, basically any of the mediums to be able to attach the stone to the dop. or this brass piece right here. However, I'm using epoxy in this case because it grips a lot better than any of the other types of material. And I really, at this point, after so many hours of doing the pavilion, do not want the stone to fall out. If it falls out, you can never properly get it 100% lined back up um, exactly the way it was before. So your cuts will always be off by however different or however much difference there was before and after. So I purposefully used epoxy and let this sit for like 2 or 3 days just to ensure it's fully cured so the stone is not going to fall out of the top. Okay, alright. Gonna go on to the next. So again, right now I'm just rough cutting, so there's no specific measurement I'm trying to match. I'm just trying to figure out where I should cut to on one facet so the rest of the facets will follow. But I am doing it carefully across all three to make sure everything's going to line up properly. So now you can see how much deeper that the facet right here is versus the facet right here. So there's a before. And here should be the after. So you can see how much deeper the cut is now here versus how it was just before it was cut. So another thing is sometimes these facets will match at the edge, whereas sometimes they won't because of the way that the stone was rough pre-cut when it came out of the ground and they were trying to grade it. So I'm going to, or at least classify how clear it is. So I'm going to have to go through and make sure that all the corners line up and they create a nice edge. Otherwise, some of the angles might be a little bit off. But that's something that it should happen automatically, and it's not something I have to really spend that much time correcting for. Excuse me. Alright, so there we go. We got a couple of the sides done. In comparison to what we're looking for, I need the top part of this jaw right here to be what I'm cutting to. So you can see that there's quite a bit of room for me to cut to that in its current state. So just slow and steady, measure twice, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times before you cut. Because if you go too far, then you got to start all over again. Or have a very thin girdle. That's correct, yes. go. So now you can see that's much sharper of a cut than it was before. But again, we still got quite a bit of distance to go to hit that 0.5. I mean, it's close, but it's still quite a bit far away. It's getting quite a bit closer. The other thing is I want to slightly undercut this a little bit, so that way during the polishing stage I can very slightly use that polishing to get to the final desired girdle width thickness. In my case, the difference would be like I would cut down to 0.054, maybe 5.5 when I'm trying to get to 0.05. 0. Um, and then I would take the polishing that 0.005 down to the 0.050 measurement. It's an art and it's also a science, as you have to make sure you balance all of the cuts necessary with actual data. So there we go, still slowly making its way down. So I'm actually going to stop this for a moment and zero out my dial. On this dial, it goes between a 0. It does make sense if you're using it for the machine's intent or the machinist's intended purpose. But for my specific example, I just need to know to go to consistent spots that are marked with on the dial. So I'm going to end up zeroing this out to go back to 0 since I'm currently at a 10, right? So that way it's just easier for me to know, hey, how far away I am from the 0 spot on the dial. The 0 in this case would indicate that it is at a perfect 90, or I'm sorry, 56 degrees, this whole quill section. So that is what the numbers would represent in that case. And to zero it, basically all I'm doing is slowly adjusting my machine right here. Unfortunately, I don't can't get it quite down far enough. But there is a manual tuner adjustment just below the camera here. You might be able to see the top part of it. It's just a silver barrel gear that turns back and forth that raises and lowers this whole white head assembly up or down as you turn the barrel gear. So now everything has been re-zeroed at the current area back to 56. Okay, now I'm just making sure that each of these is at the same distance. There we go. So if this side wasn't cut in, it would look like this, where you have this corner section that still has not been cut, and that gives you an idea of how far of a depth of cut has been done so far. Again, I'm trying to get to this 0.05 here, so I'm fairly close right there, but I still got a little bit to go. So this side apparently I've already cut a little too much off of, which is fine. The epoxy makes it a little bit difficult to see through too, just because it tends to mask any of the facets that have been cut, since it's already clear to begin with. So one of the solutions I can do is actually try and remove some of the epoxy so I can see where the bottom girdle facet is in order to be able to continue to accurately measure. I'm still quite a bit far off. Not by very much. I'm probably at like 0.07, if I had to guess. I might, depending on how thick this looks, go a little thinner too on the girdle. Okay. That was overcut already. Excellent. Still quite a bit far off. Okay, so what I'm seeing so far, see if I can adjust this. There we go. There we go. So you might be able to see just in this image how one side appears to be a little bit taller than the other. So that's what I was talking about with the stepping. So this side right here is shorter than this side right here. Or I shouldn't say shorter, I should say lower than the other. It, normally you would want this to be completely straight across, and that is the end goal. But what I have to do first is correct for any slop in my machine or whatnot. and adjust that so that way all of the lines will line up. Because otherwise you're going to have something that looks kind of like this going all the way around. So you'll have one that matches up with the other, but the other's a little too high or a little too low. So this is part of the finessing of this section of cuts, and that is to just basically make sure that everything is straight and not doing any sort of weird stair stepping as you're seeing here. So to correct for this, I have what's called the cheater. And the cheater is just a bar right here. I'm just going to pull my board camera around because it will be able to view it. So this is the cheater. Get it to focus. There we go. So as you can see, there's a 0 on that where I currently have the stone set to. So I can either adjust this slightly left or slightly right to compensate on the stone for the unevenness in the girdle width, to get rid of that stair stepping and bring both the low side on one side up and the high side on the other side down. That way you have an even girdle around the complete circumference of the stone. In my case, I just got to remember which way I want it to go. I'm not going to, I'll spare you the details of looking at that and just set this back up to where it was. Come on. I believe it was right around here. There we go. The white you're seeing on top of that stone there, once I stopped getting it moved around, was the super glue that was holding the crown part of the stone onto the dop when I was cutting the pavilion. So if I want it to go, I need to adjust it. Which way do I need to adjust it? I'm trying to remember. Yeah, I believe I want it to move a little bit backward. Okay. So now this is going to subtly change the meet points and where they would meet at. Just going to start by doing a light cut. There we go. Okay. That seems now like it's a little... Hmm. This is one of the harder parts of the stone cutting process because you're trying to figure out which, or at least for me, because I'm trying to figure out which direction I need to go and it's... Hmm. I always get this section confused. Well, what I might end up doing while I try to figure this out so you don't have to sit here looking at me stumped is stop this video for now, and then I'll just come back with part two when I figured it out. Because I do plan on cutting a couple more facets today before I have to call it a day. Um, so yeah, for now, I'm just gonna stop this then, figure that out, and then I'll come back when I got it all figured out. But other than that, see you in the next video.